This conference will now be recorded.
Yeah. Good afternoon. Oh, can you hear me? If you can hear me,
Yes.
just say yes. One of you.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So due to this power cut multiple times, I could not come to this session early. Okay. So today we will revise the topic nutrition therapy. This topic has been already been taught to you by Dr. Loknatham sir. So he asked me to take this topic just for a revision purpose. Okay. So I'll just brief you out about this nutrition therapy, and this topic is very important for this examination purpose also. Okay. So starting with the nutrition therapy. So malnutrition is a common phenomenon. You can see in any patient. So whenever a patient comes with the to the surgical OPD, or when the patient, when you plan for a surgery, the post-operative period also the patient may face a malnutrition problem. So the incidence is 30% in those patients who are suffering from gastrointestinal disease. The rate of malnutrition is around 30%. And in those patients who had a prolonged hospital stay due to post-operative complications, so in those group of patients, there is 60% of incidence of malnutrition. Okay. So due to this malnutrition or due to starvation, there is a high risk of complications and high risk of death. Okay. Next. So we need to categorize this. We need to identify the patients who are at risk for malnutrition, and we have to categorize and we have to give the appropriate nutritional support. So to decrease these complications and death rate. So this is a brief introduction. This is not of importance to you. Just a brief introduction. So here is a case of a malnourished gentleman is having wasting of the fat and wasting of the muscles. Okay. So we'll have a brief review of, before going to the nutrition topic, we'll have a brief review of this metabolic response. So this is an important question. So anytime in the examination, they may ask you metabolic response to the trauma, sepsis, or surgery, and metabolic response to starvation. This is a very important question, and you need to know. And in general practice also, so once you come out of MBBS and you pass out, and when you are a house surgeon, so any person who is under starvation or in your day-to-day clinical practice, when you see in the hospital, what IV fluids will be put, what IV fluids will be kept in a starvation person or a malnutrition person, or a who has undergone surgery, or who has met with a trauma, or who has presented to the casualty with the septic shock. So in these patients, what are the metabolic changes occurring in the body at the time of injury? So for example, I'll take myself as an example. So this is a metabolic response to starvation. So నేను నిరాహార దీక్ష చేద్దాం అనుకొని డిసైడ్ అయ్యానండి. So at morning, from tomorrow morning, I have started doing starvation. So in the morning 6 o'clock, I have not eaten anything. Okay, I have not eaten anything. I have started tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock. So there will be no glucose intake within my body. So what happens? Whenever there is a glucose intake, there will be increase in the insulin levels. Okay. So when there is no glucose level, there will be a decrease in the insulin level. So the first point. So before that, I want to categorize these metabolic responses into three periods. That is, what is happening up to 24 hours, what is happening, what are the body changes occurring, metabolic response happening inside my body between 24 to 48 hours and after 48 hours. So during the first 24 hours, what happens is, so I have not taken any meal, so I am starving. So what happens? There will be insulin will be low, but there will be increase in glucagon levels. So what this glucagon will do? It will go into the liver. In the liver, it will stimulate the initial glycogen reserves. there occurs a process of glycogenolysis. Glycogenolysis means it is conversion of the glycogen to glucose. So the glucose is produced. So how much amount of glycogen? 200 grams of glycogen has been broken down to produce glucose. This glucose is utilized by my central nervous system, that is the brain tissue, hematopoietic system, that is RBC, WBC, and the renal medulla. Okay. So next, what the next step is, there is additional glycogen reserves are there. Apart from the glycogen reserves in the liver, there are additional glycogen reserves which are stored in the skeletal muscle. Next slide is additional glycogen reserves are stored in the skeletal muscle. These will be around 500 grams of the skeletal muscle will be broken down. Glycose, not muscle. The glycogen stores within the skeletal muscle will be broken down through the process of glycogenolysis within the skeletal muscle. Okay, so what happens? The glycogen will be converted here into lactate, not glucose. So it is an indirect production of glucose production. There in the liver, there is a direct production of glucose from glycogen to glucose. Here in the skeletal muscle, there will be a indirect. That is, first glycogen will be converted to lactate in the muscle. From muscle, lactate will be going into the liver, and through the process of Cori cycle, it will be converted to the glucose. Okay, this will be utilized by the body tissues. Okay, this is the first 24 hours what will happen in my body if I going to starve. So after 20, still I want to starve, still I have continued my starvation period. So after 24 hours, then what will happen? So there will be all the glycogen stores, whatever is there, will be depleted. So but the body needs additional glucose because I'm still starving. So from where the glucose will be coming? It will be coming from some non-carbohydrate sources. From non-carbohydrate sources. Apart from non-carbohydrate means that is protein and fat. Okay, that is protein and fat. What happens is the next slide. So this is the 24 to 48 hours period. So glycogen stores will be depleted. So glucose production is from the non-carbohydrate sources, that is in the protein and the fat. First, coming to the protein, what happens? There will be catabolism of the protein. Catabolism of the protein within the skeletal muscle, that is up to 75 grams per day. Up to 75 grams per day within the skeletal muscle, it is used up in protein catabolism. So what happens when protein catabolism occurs? There will be production of amino acids. There will be production of amino acids, mainly glutamine and alanine. Okay, these are taken up by the liver and these form glucose. They produce glucose. So this process is called gluconeogenesis, that is de novo synthesis of glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. This is called hepatic gluconeogenesis. Okay, at this stage, if I stop my starvation and take glucose orally, okay, glucon D powder I take orally, what happens? This all mechanisms will get reverse. This all mechanisms will be get reverse and will come to the normal homeostasis mechanism of my body. So at this stage, you can reverse this step by giving exogenous glucose administration. Okay, so this is the protein catabolism. So next is the, so if still I'm I didn't listen, I will continue to starve. Okay, I will continue to starve, that is after 48 hours. So what happens then? The fat will take into the fat will come into the step. Okay, so fat, what will happen is there will be oxidation of the fat. So the next slide will be, so there will be oxidation of the fat. So whenever there is an oxidation of fat, what happens? The byproducts are glycerol and fatty acids. So this glycerol will be converted into glucose and these fatty acids will be taken up by all the body tissues, which is the source of energy. But the fatty acids will go to the liver and they will produce ketone bodies within the liver. They will produce ketone bodies within the liver. This is called as adaptive ketogenesis. So through this adaptive ketogenesis, ketone bodies are produced, and the primary source of fuel, primary source of energy for the central nervous system or the brain is ketones, but not the glucose. But the rest of the body tissues will be taking glucose as their energy after 48 hours, but exclusively brain will take ketone as their energy source after 48 hours. And by fat oxidation, there is an advantage that the protein breakdown, what I have said between the 24 to 48 hours period, what the protein breakdown, that is 75 grams per day, has been reduced to 55 grams per day. So only 20 grams of, only 20 grams of, so only 20 grams will be catabolized. 20 grams of skeletal muscle will be involved in protein catabolism. The rest of the 55 grams it has reduced. So it, by doing this, what will happen? So by doing this, fat is helping the skeletal muscle to prevent muscle wasting. So prevent muscle wasting. Okay. So another adaptive response which will take place during starvation is there will be decrease in the resting energy expenditure. That is, at the rest, how much when the body is at rest, there will be some expenditure of the energy while at rest also. Without doing activity also, there will be some expenditure of the energy during rest. So that is around 25 to 30 kilocalories per kg per day. That will be also decreased. That will be also decreased to 15 to 20 kilocalories per kg per day. This will occur by inhibition or decrease in the conversion of the inactive T4 to active T3. So T4 converting to T3, which is an important metabolic step for the metabolism. Okay, for the metabolism, heat production, everything, it is T4 is converted to T3. So this conversion of T4 to T3 is inhibited. Okay, or it is the step is declined. Okay. Next is, apart from all these metabolic responses, glucose has been produced. So apart from this, still the body requires some amount of glucose, that is around 200 grams of obligatory glucose. Obligatory is mandatory or compulsory glucose is required. Though what are the metabolic responses which are taking place in the protein, muscle, fat, and the liver. So apart from those, additional 200 grams is required for the body. Okay. So this is the metabolic response to starvation when the person is undergoing a starvation period. Okay. Next. So next is, this is also very important one. This is a metabolic response to trauma, sepsis, or surgery. To trauma, sepsis, or surgery. You will have to consider this is purely surgical class. So in the surgery, what you will see generally, I'm telling you. So when surgery, when you do a surgery for a patient, or you will see patients with a trauma to the coming to the casualty department, or you will see patients who come to the casualty department or the surgical OPD with some infection, diabetic foot infection. So in these patients, you will see this scenario. What are the responses will occur in this group of patients? So you can see this. So there is this diagram is very important. Okay, this is in Bayesian law. Okay, this picture is depicted in Bayesian law very nicely, and this you have to by heart it. Somehow you have to by heart it. If you write this one, that is sufficient. Okay, if you write, if you depict this diagram in your answer sheet, that is very much sufficient. Okay, so what happens is, here you can see there is an injury. There is an injury. It could be a trauma or a surgery, to some tissue. So what happens? There are efferent nociceptive pathways. You have to remember four things. That is, after injury, there are four things which are getting stimulated. That is the efferent nociceptive pathways, the spinal cord, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. Okay. So efferent nociceptive means there are the pain receptors. Pain receptor present in the neurons. So whenever there is an injury or a cut to the patient or a trauma to the patient, those pain is transmitted to the spinal cord through the thalamus into the hypothalamus, and this hypothalamus release a factor known as corticotropin releasing factor. Corticotropin releasing factor. This corticotropin releasing factor will stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to produce the two hormones, that is ACTH and GH, that is adrenocorticotropic hormone and the growth hormone within the blood. So what happens is this growth hormone, what it will do is it will act on the fat cells. It will act on the fat cells causing lipolysis to produce fatty acids. Okay. And this adrenocorticotropic hormone, what it will do is it will stimulate the adrenal gland, that is adrenal cortex. Adrenal cortex, it has adrenal medulla inside and adrenal cortex outside. This adrenal cortex is stimulated to form the cortisol. Okay, and at the same time, this hypothalamic activation also causes the stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system. This sympathetic nervous system stimulates the adrenal medulla, inside the part is adrenal medulla. This adrenal medulla secretes adrenaline and noradrenaline. Okay, this adrenaline, noradrenaline, and cortisol will lead to the hepatic gluconeogenesis, that is glucose production, de novo glucose production within the liver, and skeletal muscle protein degradation to form glucose. Okay, skeletal muscle protein degradation to form glucose from glycogenolysis. Okay, next is this sympathetic nervous system activation stimulates the pancreas to produce glucagon. This glucagon, what happens, it will produce acute phase proteins within the liver. It will produce acute phase proteins within the liver. So these are the organs which are, this you should be remembering, that is, one is the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal gland, and the pancreas, and the hormones which are being secreted and their actions in the body. Okay, so there is another system which is acting here, that is the innate immune system. Innate immune system is nothing but the macrophages. So macrophages are the innate immune system. These macrophages will be interacting with this adaptive immune system. The adaptive immune system is nothing but the T cells and the B cells. There will be interaction between the macrophages, T cells and B cells, and they will produce pro-inflammatory cytokines. Pro-inflammatory cytokines, this is a very important bit. Okay, very important bit, and you should remember these four factors. Pro-inflammatory cytokines is interleukin 1, interleukin 6, interleukin 8, and tumor necrosis factor alpha. So definitely you should by heart this. And even if you ask pro-inflammatory cycle, only 4, 1, 6, 8, tumor necrosis factor alpha. So this interleukin 1, 6, 8, tumor necrosis factor alpha, what happens is it will stimulate some organs, that is hypothalamus, liver, and the skeletal muscle. So hypothalamus, if it stimulates, it causes pyrexia, that is, it will increase the temperature by stimulating the hypothalamus. Whereas within the liver, if you go to the liver and it produces acute phase proteins, it will produce acute phase proteins, and the skeletal muscle, it will result in protein catabolism. It will stimulate the protein catabolism mechanism within the skeletal muscle. Okay, so along with this, what happens, there will be a decrease in the insulin level, decrease in the insulin like growth factor 1, testosterone production will be low, and T3 production will be low. Okay, so this will finally lead into a hypermetabolic state. This will finally lead into a hypermetabolic state. It's not mentioned in these slides. I just want to tell. So whenever these pro-inflammatory cytokines are released, there is an antagonist, that is the endogenous cytokine antagonist to this pro-inflammatory cytokines. Okay, those are interleukin 4, 5, 9, and 13. 4, 5, 9, 13, and transforming growth factor beta. These are also very important. Okay, they counteract with these pro-inflammatory cytokines and they will reduce the actions of pro-inflammatory cytokines. Okay, these are all produced, and there is some receptors like interleukin 1 receptor alpha and tumor necrosis factor receptors, that is 55 and 75. So these are they counteract with this pro-inflammatory cytokines and they reduce the inflammation, and they will try to reduce the inflammation, and this is called as compensatory anti-inflammatory response syndrome, CARS. It is abbreviated as CARS, CARS. Okay, CARS means compensatory anti-inflammatory response syndrome. Okay, if this CARS response is prolonged, that is, so if you there is an inflammation, there is an injury, and there is inflammation, and there is a increase in the pro-inflammatory cytokines, and for this there are counteractive 4593 interleukins are produced. At this stage, the step should be limited by giving an antibiotics, or you should resuscitate the patient. If this CARS response been prolonged for a more time, and you have not acted by giving antibiotics, or you are not giving any nutritional support to the patient, what happens is the patient will be going into immunosuppression. So contraction and interaction of these cytokines will result in an immunosuppressive state to the patient. So whenever there is an immunosuppressive state to the patient will be more prone for nosocomial infection, that is hospital acquired infection, nosocomial infection, and opportunistic infections. Okay, so this course should not be prolonged by active intervention by the surgeon. Okay, so this is what happening. This is a short brief introduction regarding the metabolic response to the trauma and sepsis. So there are two differences you should be knowing between the metabolic response which is occurring in the starvation, and metabolic response which is occurring in the trauma and the sepsis. So there are only two differentiating factors. In metabolic response due to starvation, I have told you the protein catabolism can be reversed by giving exogenous glucon D powder. Okay, glucose administration, exogenous glucose administration, you can reverse the process of catabolism. But in this, once the protein catabolism has been started, once you give exogenous oral glucose administration also, that step will not be reversed. Okay, that is one thing. And number two thing is, in metabolic response in starvation, there is adaptive ketogenesis, that is formation of ketone bodies. But in this metabolic response to trauma and sepsis, there is no formation of ketone bodies. There is no formation of ketone bodies. And there is a state of hypermetabolism. There is a state of hypermetabolism in the metabolic response to trauma and sepsis. Okay. So these are the differentiating points between those two things. Oh, what?
Sir, a doubt, sir, in the previous slide.
Yeah, what? Tell me.
Yes, sir. T3, if it is decreases, means thyroid hormones help in increasing the metabolic rate, sir. So, like, how will the T3 decrease causes hypermetabolism?
Yeah, you are right actually, but it has given, but T3, T4, actually it is you are right only, that is hypermetabolic state. You there will be more, if more T3 is there, there will be hypermetabolism. So that is you have raised a good point actually. So when T3 is decreased, there will be actually decreased metabolism. So I'll try to find out and tell you. Okay.
Okay, sir.
But
Sir,
rest
and
of the
one
thing,
more
did
doubt,
you
sir.
understand that the rest of the thing? Have you understood?
Yes, sir. One more doubt, sir. Sir, this counter-inflammatory means if these pro-inflammatory factors are increasing in our body, they'll try to counteract the present infection, right? So if our body,
No, they are not. What happens is whenever there is an infection, so whenever there is an infection, there will be increase in they will not contract. Due to the result of the infection, these will be
response.
elevated.
Okay.
Interleukin 168 human necrosis factor will be elevated, and these will damage the organs actually.
Okay.
So these will damage the organs. For these pro-inflammatory cytokines, what will happen means there will be an endogenous cytokine antagonist will be produced within the body. Okay. So within the hours. So whenever there is an injury or a cut to the body, these pro-inflammatory cytokines will be increased. Okay. So within hours, body will detect, and body has the system to fight with these pro-inflammatory cytokines by producing some what I have told you, that is interleukin 4, 5, 9, 13, transforming growth factor beta, and there are some receptors to this one. Interleukin 1 receptor antagonist is there, and human necrosis factor receptor anti-antagonists are also there. So these will
Yes.
act over these things and they will try to compensate it. Okay, this is called compensatory anti-inflammatory response syndrome. Okay,
Yes,
there
sir.
will be
Sir,
a fight between these two things. Okay.
yes, sir. This I have understood, sir. Sir, one thing is, to some extent, these pro-inflammatory factors are good for our body.
To some extent, actually, they will cause more damage. See,
Okay.
whenever there is an cut, there will be an inflammatory mediators will be released. Okay, these inflammatory mediators will actually damage the system. So these
Okay.
are actually the cause for this loss of appetite, decreased intake of the food, and these will be damaging. Or what I have told is there will be uh, damage to the skeletal muscle. See, skeletal muscle will be undergoing protein catabolism. Okay, there will be increased protein catabolism with this within the this one to produce glucose, everything. Okay, and
Okay.
what I have told is they will be acting on the liver, muscle, and hypothalamus to produce pyrexia. See, whenever there is an infection or injury, there will be increase in heart rate, increase in the temperature of the body. Okay, these are actually the responses following the insult, following the insult. Okay.
Okay, sir.
Sorry, what question you have asked? Actually, you are telling me
Yeah.
these are protective.
Means to some extent our body shows this response to curtail the infection, right, sir? So
Hmm.
as soon as possible we have to decrease this so that there
We
is no
have to
further
decrease.
tissue damage.
See, that's what. See, what happens in you may have studied in the pathology, Robbins. Whenever there is a, for suppose there is a injury to the blood vessel, capillary vessel. What happens? There will be an endothelial damage. Whenever there is an endothelial damage, there will be a accumulation of the neutrophils, macrophages, platelets, and it forms a thrombus. Okay, so in that way, that is the body mechanism to stop the process of bleeding. In the same way, whenever there is an injury or an insult to the body, whenever there is a cut or infection, so within 24 hours there will be an increase in the pro-inflammatory cytokine. These pro-inflammatory cytokines will be damaging. Actually, they will be damaging the body metabolic system. So whenever so these responses to be, we need to control it. We need to control it as early as possible. That is, by giving this, we need to give a proper IV fluid. We need to give a dextrose, and we need to give a what is that? We need to um, suture the wound, and we need to give a proper antibiotics. Okay, if you leave it like that, if there is an injury and an infection is there, trauma is there, if you leave it like this, the pro-inflammatory cytokines will be increased. They will be acting on the kidney also. It will cause renal shutdown, and there will be vasoconstriction with poor renal urine output. So what happens is, this is the natural body mechanism to produce the endogenous cytokine antagonist to counteract with these cytokines 168. Okay, to prevent that one. But if this compensatory anti-inflammatory response syndrome, this compensatory mechanism, compensatory means it is compensating, the body is compensating by producing some what these endogenous cytokine antagonists. When this compensatory mechanism is prolonged, that is, you are not intervening at the correct time, you are not intervening, you are not giving a proper antibiotic, you are not giving IV fluids to the patient, you are not preventing this response. So if this response syndrome is continuing for a prolonged period, what happens is, there will be, patient will be going into an immunosuppressive state. This immunosuppressive state, you see, whenever there is immunosuppressive state, patient will be going into this should be is more exposed to this
Opportunistic infection.
opportunistic infections or nosocomial infection. And another thing I have forgot to tell you is, this is at the systemic level, what is happening within the blood systemic level. So at the inflamed tissue level, that is, whenever there is an inflammation, there is a cut over the hand, at that area what is happening is, there will be some specialized, there are specialized pro resolving mediators, that is lipoxins, resolvins, protectins, and marsins. These are the 4 important things which will act at the inflamed tissue. They will take the neutrophils, polymorphonuclear neutrophils, and they will clear off the debris, cellular debris, and these neutrophils. Okay, so it will act at the cellular level and it will act in the systemic level also. Okay, so these in the systemic level, it is that is interleukin 168 contracted by the 45913 and transforming growth factor beta. And at the inflamed tissue, that is at the molecular level, these lipoxins, resolvins, marsins, and protectins will be involved in controlling the inflammation. Okay, so this is actually given in the Bayesian law. You can read it in the Bayesian law also. It has a very clearly it has given. Okay, so can I go to next slide?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. So these are the changes which are occurring in the metabolic response in the trauma, sepsis, and the surgery. Okay. So next is the nutritional assessment. So once now you have now the patient has come to the surgical OPD. Now you have to assess for the nutrition. Okay. Now the patient is going to patient is having any trauma, if the patient is having any sepsis, or if he is a post-surgical patient. Now you have to assess the nutritional status of this. There are some parameters, that is clinical, laboratory, anthropometric parameters are there. So before going to the anthropometry and the laboratory evaluation, for nutritionally whether the patient is under malnourished or normally nourished or undernourished. So overnourished, malnourished, or normally nourished, we have to detect. So that you can do it by 3 parameters, that is the clinical, laboratory, and the anthropometry. So first, coming to the clinical, you have to take a thorough history regarding if the patient is previously having any past history of malnutrition, if there is any history of malabsorption, any history of medical condition, that is diabetes, hypertension, tuberculosis, epilepsy, asthma, any other conditions are there, or whether the patient is suffering from any metabolic disorders, and if the patient is having any drug dependency to a specific group of drugs, or the patient is alcoholic or smoker or not. So these are the history. You should take a thorough history and followed by a clinical examination of the patient from the head to toe. Okay, so next is the must stool. This must stool, malnutrition universal screening tool. This is given by the British Association for Enteral and Parenteral Nutrition. They have given this must stool. This must tool is very important. You have to by heart it. Somehow you have to by heart it. Okay, this must tool is malnutrition universal screening tool. Okay, this will take 3 factors. Simple, it is very simple. You have to take, number 1 is the BMI, body mass index. You may be knowing, that is weight in kg by height in square meters. And another thing is weight loss. So weight loss in 3 to 6 months. And another thing is acute disease effect. These 3 things you should remember: BMI, weight loss, and acute disease effect. So how is, so you BMI, you give a score of 0, 1, and 2. So 0 is more than 20 kilogram per square meter. 1 is 18.5 to 2. It is not 2, it is 20. Okay, it is a printing mistake. 20 kilograms per meter square, and 2 is less than 18.5 kilogram per meter square. In the weight loss, in the preceding 3 to 6 months, if there is any less than 5% of weight loss, you give a score of 0. 5 to 10% of weight loss, you give a score of 1, and more than 10% of body weight loss, you give a score of 2. Okay, so next is acute disease effect. So add a score of 2, give a score. Here there is no 0, 1, 2. You give a score of 2 if the patient has not taken, or if he has taken inadequate nutrition for the last 5 days, or more than or equal to 5 days. Last 5 days the patient has not taken any food, or the patient has taken food but very inadequate, then you give a score of 2. Here there is no 0 and 1, 2. So for example, the patient is having a BMI of 20 with a weight loss of less than 5% to 3 to 6 months, but the patient has an inadequate intake of food or not taken food for the past 5 days. So you give a score 0 plus 0 plus 2. Okay, the score will be 2. Okay, so if you add the score, they can be categorized as 0, 1 and 2. So we got a score of 2. So the patient will come at the high risk for undernutrition. Patient will be coming into high risk for undernutrition. So they can be categorized as low risk, medium risk and high risk. So depending upon the each category, you will be giving a specific treatment. So the low risk is patient is having routine clinical care will be if there is a low risk 0 is there, then you will give then what is the treatment is at the if the patient is admitted in the hospital, you every week you repeat this screening. Okay, every week you repeat the screening. And if the patient is in the care homes, then you repeat the screening every month. And with the community groups, that is those groups which are present in the community which are suffering from the similar complaints. Okay, their screening tool should be applied in the community every year. Okay, those who come in the medium group who are admitted in the hospital, you give a diet and fluid intake for 3 days. Okay, at the care home, same as the hospital, that is you give diet and fluid for intake for 3 days and repeat for screening. Okay, in the community you will repeat screening with from 1 month to 6 months, between 1 to 6 months you will repeat screening. Okay, next, in the hospital, if the score is high risk malnourished patients, in the hospital you refer to a dietitian, you give food which is fortified with protein, iron, iron, magnesium, zinc, and you will give multivitamin tablets. And food will be fortified. Fortified food means you will give which food which is fortified with iron and other minerals. Okay, next, at the care homes and the community also you give the same thing, food fortification. Okay, so this is the must tool. And for suppose if the height of the patient or weight of the patient or weight loss cannot be established, okay, then we will ask the patient his documented weight, the previous documented weight or recalled weight, that is recently what the patient remembers his weight is measured. Okay, what he recalls, or in the recent he may remember some weight or weight with the weight of the body, so that you should record and you will note it down. Okay, next is the if neither can be calculated, if height, weight or weight loss cannot be calculated, and if the patient cannot recall his weight also, if the patient cannot recall, I don't remember the weight recently also, I have not checked my weight, and the recent weight also I don't know anything, then you should you should look for the general examination whether patient is very thin average or overbuilt or not. You should take. Now that is number one thing. Number two thing is you have to ask whether babu బట్టలు ఏమన్నా లూజ్ అయిపోయినాయా, లేకపోతే for if females, women, if jewelry is getting any became loose fitting or not, you should be asking. Okay, in the history, and you will be asking, is there any history of recent decreased food intake, or is there any decreased appetite, or is there any difficulty in swallowing during the previous 3 to 6 months. So these should be asked. And number 3 is you should ask for any history of psychosocial, patient is having some mental disorder, or the patient is having some physical disability, that is he may be having some injury to the hands or the wrist or the forearm, or if the patient is unable to move. So in that case, this patient may have a decreased poor appetite, because he will not be going to the work, he may not having adequate food intake. So in such cases there may be weight loss. So these all history should be asked. So this must tool is very important and you should remember it. It may come as a 2 marks question also, just they may given as must tool, you should write this chart. Okay, and after that clinical, laboratory evaluation. So laboratory evaluation, serum albumin, pre-albumin and transferrin. So Pre-albumin transferrin, here we are not doing any these tests, but serum albumin is yes significant, but it is not a significant factor for determining whether the patient is malnourished or not, because this serum albumin will give you a long-term indication whether the patient is nourished or not in acute conditions. Because in acute condition what happens is, so if the patient comes with a trauma, if the patient undergoes a surgery, or if the patient is in sepsis and the patient is in septic shock, then you have sent the blood investigations LFT, in that you will have serum albumin level. So in the serum albumin level, there will be a sudden decrease in the serum albumin level. Usually it is 3.5 to 5. Okay, if it is less than 3, if it is less than 3, then you should not think that it is hypoalbuminemia patient, because what happens in acute inflammatory conditions, there will be increase in the capillary permeability of the capillary wall. In the vessel wall, there will be endothelial injury and increased capillary permeability. When there is an increased capillary permeability, the fluid will be lost from the intravascular to the outside interstitial fluid. So what happens, the proteins will be going from the intravascular to the interstitial fluid. So there will be a dilutional. So there will be a dilutional hypoalbuminemia. That is, there will be a decrease in the sudden decrease in the albumin levels. So this is not a very good indicator for a malnourished patient. Okay. So but serum albumin you will measure for whether if the patient is for example, if the patient is a surgical patient who come to the OPD for he planned for some Whipple surgery or a major surgery, gastrectomy or something. For that patient, serum albumin is a good indicator for whether the patient is malnourished or normally nourished. Okay, in acute cases, that is if the patient come with the trauma and if you check the serum albumin, it is of no use. Okay, that is the thing you should remember. Next is the anthropometry evaluation. The anthropometry evaluation will take ideal body weight, skin fold thickness, mid-arm circumference, and the BMI. Okay, so BMI, all these things are also not a good significant factors for acute malnourished patient, but for a long-term malnourished patient, these are important. Okay, by ideal body weight you will measure with the graduated scales. That is, if my body weight, my age, and my height. Okay, if I am some 6 feet and my weight is 85, so I will compare with the standard values. So for a 6 foot man with a body weight of 85 kgs, so what should be the weight? Is it an 80 kgs or 70 kgs, or is he overweight or underweight? That you will check with the standard values. Okay, that is the thing you will measure. So BMI you will be knowing. This is also very important. They may ask as a 2 marks question also. Body mass index will give you the fat stores in the body. Okay, they will give you the fat stores, how much amount of fat stores are there in your body. It can be graded as severely underweight, normal, overweight, and obesity grade 1, grade 2, grade 3. So here the severely underweight, you remember, severely underweight less than 16.5 kilograms per square meter. If the patient is less than 16.5 kilograms per meter, there is a high risk of mortality. There is a high risk of mortality. So, and if the patient is less than 18.5 kilograms per square meter, then patient is malnourished. Patient is having a long-term malnourishment. Okay, that you should remember. And these gradings I am not discussing, you just remember it. Okay, normal is the 18.5 to 24.9. Okay, you just add 4 4 4 4 4. Okay, 24 25 to 29, add 4 30 to 34 point, add 4.9 4.9, that is sufficient. Okay, then you will easily remember. So next is the imaging. This very rarely we are doing it. No one is doing this one also to detect malnourishment. So what this just you remember the names, that is DEXA. DEXA is dual energy X-ray absorptiometry. Actually it is not done for this malnourishment. This DEXA, this DEXA is actually present in some high-end centers with high-end scanning centers. So it will give you the bone mineral density, how much amount of mineral is there in the bone mineral. That is, they will see for the vertebra. the vertebra, they will see the mineral density, how much is there. There are actually calculated in some standard deviation units, -1 to -2, like that standard deviation. If it is very less, it is indicates that if the patient is having a chance of a risk of fracture, vertebral fracture or osteoporosis or like that. So dual energy X-ray absorptiometry will also give you the some additional information regarding this protein and fat also within the body, but mostly this is used for bone mineral density. Just you remember the name DEXA. CT ultrasound also no one is doing it, but it will also give whether if you put on a muzzle, you can see whether there is muzzle wasting or not. We can see on ultrasound. In CT you can see Hounsfield units. CT is in measured as Hounsfield units, HU. That is, if you keep the cursor or the or the muzzle or the fat, you can see whether there is a wasting or not, whether there is a decrease in the Hounsfield units. So there will be some normal Hounsfield units for a normal muzzle and a normal fat. So if there is a decrease in the Hounsfield units in the muzzle and fat, you can see that there is a wasting of the fat or wasting of the muzzle. So usually these are not been done. Okay. So once the when the patient nutritional assessment has been done, so whether the patient is malnourished or undernourished, malnourished or normalnourished or overnourished. So once the patient is malnourished, we came to know. Now you have to give some nutritional requirements to the patient. That is, there are two macronutrients and micronutrients. You know, macronutrients are the carbohydrate, fat, and proteins, and the micronutrients which come minerals, vitamins, trace elements, electrolytes, and water. Okay. So once you have estimated the nutrition requirements, so how much amount should be given? There are some formulas. Actually, I'm not discussing those all formulas. It is a very huge topic. If you want, I will be discussing in the next topic called next class. And the previous clinical anthropometric, nutritional assessment also very wide chapter, which will be not useful at your level, MBBS level. It is not useful. Just you remember those names, and those formulas also are not much required. If you are interested, I will be telling you in the next class. Okay. For now, I will be discussing about these nutritional requirements. So once the nutritional requirements for a body, for a patient, you have suggested some nutritional requirements, and you have given the nutrition required for the patient. Then you need to monitor whether you are giving additional, you are giving over, or you are giving under. You are giving, are you feeding the patient overfeeding, or you are underfeeding? That you need to know correctly, because while you giving feeding, so if you give overfeeding, it is more risk than doing underfeeding. Okay. So you have some monitoring feeding regimens. So daily you should do daily regimens are there, weekly regimens are there, every second weekly regimens are there, fortnightly. So these table also you should maximum you should remember. Okay. Daily, how you will check? Daily you will be checking the body weight, fluid balance, blood count, urea, electrolytes, all these things usually we don't do in the daily clinical practice, to be frankly speaking. Okay. So these all tests only for the theoretical purpose, for your exam purpose, you need to remember. But in your clinical practice, no one is going to do all these things. Only the patient will be checked for the temperature, or urea electrolytes will be sent, and the blood glucose will be sent. Or additionally, we will send for liver function tests. But iron, folate, vitamin B2, lactate, yes, we will send based depending upon the patient condition. See, for example, if the patient is having, he has undergone some intestinal resection. So international resection, the terminal ileum, it is very, very important for the vitamin B12 absorption. So in such patient, you will be sending for vitamin B12. If the patient is having some anemias, okay, if the patient is having some megaloblastic or iron deficiency, then in such cases iron folate is, yes, very important. Okay. If the patient is alcohol dependency of the, when the alcohol dependency patient is there, whether if the patient is having a liver failure, in such cases liver function test with clotting factors and thiamine is very important. So when the patient is in a metabolic acidosis and when the patient is having a renal failure, then you will go for an ABG analysis, that is acid base gas, arterial blood gas analysis for the acid base status. So only in some specific patients you will be doing these all tests, okay? But routinely we don't do it. Usually these tests will be done when the patient is in a post-operative patient or in a patient who is in a trauma, septic shock, or in sepsis. You will do in the ICU setting these all type of tests, not all the tests, but mostly, okay? Urea, electrolyte fluid, blood count, and blood glucose daily they will send, okay? And ABG analysis will be done daily also, okay? So just you remember this table. This is also picture. This box is taken from the Bailey lab, okay? Next. So energy requirements. Once what energy, what is the how much requirement is there for a normal patient, okay? For a normal okay, sorry. For a normal patient, most of the patients who have been admitted and been hospitalized and you have done a surgery and post-operatively, how much you should give is 20 to 30 kilocalories per kg per day. This is yellow highlighted. This is very much important and you should remember this one, 20 to 30 kilocalories per kg per day. That comes to around 1300 to 1800 kilocalories per day, okay? So if the patient is having in a patient is in a hypermetabolic state, if the patient requirement is more, okay, when the patient is having any sepsis or the patient is having any high amount of if is highly malnourished, then the energy uptake energy requirement will be more, that is around 2000 kilocalories per day, and only few patients will be coming into this category who require a high energy requirement, but 20 to 30 kilocalories per kg per day. Don't remember this 1300 to 1800 kilocalories, because always body habitus will be different for each individual and the weight will vary. That's why 20 to 30 kilocalories per kg per day you should remember. In kg per day you should remember, okay? Next, carbohydrate requirement. So another 5 minutes I will tell, because I have started around 3:20. I think the topic will not be completed today. If possible, I will be discussing, as this is a revision topic, I will be discussing to you later. So now it is 3:20, 3:10. With 10 minutes, how much it will complete, I will tell you. Rest of the thing, if time permits, next class I will tell you, okay? So first is the carbohydrate requirement. So always glucose is the best carbohydrate source. Glucose is the best carbohydrate. So the mandatory glucose required for the central nervous system and the hematopoietic system, that is brain tissue and RBC WBCs, daily is 2 gram per kg per day. That is for a 60 kg body weight, it is 2 into 6, 120 grams per day is required. So for me 70 kgs or something, I will be getting, I will 140. So daily I require for my central nervous system to work, and for the RBC WBC the glucose requirement is 2 gram per kg per day. This you should remember it. Carbohydrate energy is 20 to 30 kilocalories per kg per day. And apart from the oral exogenous glucose administration, in the body, within the body also, there will be a physiological mechanism producing the glucose. The body, a normal physiological mechanism to produce glucose, that is oxidation of glucose, is around 4 milligrams per kg per minute. So per minute in a 60 kg person, it is 240, okay? 240 milligrams per minute of glucose is produced, okay, by oxidation, okay? So rest of the thing, rest of the non-oxidized glucose will be get converted into the fat and get stored, okay? So while giving the glucose also, this is why I have told this physiological glucose. This is an important point, because so body's mechanism, body is already producing physiologically some amount of glucose within the body. So in a post-operative surgical patient, you have to assess. So patient is there post-operative, you should not give 5% dextrose normal saline without any calculation. You should not give rapidly. See, for suppose usually a daily maintenance fluid therapy for a post-surgical patient is usually 2 liters, not more than 2 liters. You should not give for a normal post-surgical patient. So in that 2 liters, you should give dextrose with normal saline or ringer lactate. 2 liters means our saline bottles are 500 ml. So 500 ml into 4 bottles. So for 24 hours from morning to night, you should give only 2 liters, 4 units, 4 pints of IV fluids, crystalloids you should give. So in that dextrose, you should not give 3 dextroses, or you should not give inadequate dextrose, that is only 1 dextrose with RL and 1 NS, 1 RL, not like that. So adequate dextrose, you have to measure the weight of the patient, and you should check for the blood glucose, monitor the blood glucose level, and you should accurately give the glucose, because already body is producing the adequate glucose within the system. So you should not give overload of glucose. Okay, that is not advisable. So always avoid hyperglycemia. Always avoid hyperglycemia, and this can be checked by blood glucose level, especially in a diabetes mellitus patients. Okay. So next is the fat requirement. So fat requirement, it is 100 to 200 grams per week. The normal fat we require is 100 to 200 grams per week. Protein requirement, what I have said, protein I have not come. Fat requirement is 100 to 200 grams per week. Carbohydrate is 100 to 200 grams per day, and energy requirement is 20 to 30 kilocalories per kg per day. That you should remember. Next, what are the various types of fats? Dietary fat you will be giving. Dietary fat which is rich in long chain fatty acids. Usually our dietary fat will be rich in triglycerides, which contains 4 long chain fatty acids, that is 2 saturated and 2 unsaturated fatty acids. Those are the palmitic and stearic acid. Palmitic and stearic acid are saturated, whereas unsaturated are linoleic and linolenic acids. These 4 things you should remember. Saturated are palmitic and stearic acid. Unsaturated fatty acids. These unsaturated fatty acids, that is linoleic and linolenic acid, these are essential fatty acids. Why essential fatty acids are? These are essential to our body because they are not synthesized de novo within our body. They are not synthesized within our body. So these are essential for our body mechanism. So these are taken in the food. So sunflower oil and soybean oil are the rich in unsaturated fatty acids, that is linoleic and linolenic acid. Okay, these quantities 1 liter. If 1 liter taken per 1 week, it will correct the deficiency of fat in our body. Okay, and another thing you should remember is fat should be always given with glucose. Fat should be always given with glucose. Okay. Next, why fat should be given along with glucose? So fat and glucose, if you give, what happens is it will reduces the metabolic complications, it will reduce the carbon dioxide production, it will reduce the fluid retention, and it will enhance the substrate utilization. So whatever substrates you are giving, what are the nutrients you are giving to the patient, it will be properly utilized by the body. Okay, if any fluid retention is there, that will be also corrected by giving both glucose and fat. So when you see in the ICU, when you go to ICU, you will see there will be a mixture of glucose and fat emulsions more. Okay, they will not be given in, individually, that is fat separately, glucose separate. That I will be discussing later. That is parenteral, in the parenteral nutrition. It is not parenteral nutrition, it is parenteral nutrition. In total parenteral nutrition, I will be discussing about that. So the infusion rate of fat, whenever the fat emulsion is there, fat emulsions you are getting in the market in a bottle, which is soybean, which is contained with soybean oil, it will be looking like a milk white color. Okay, milk white color, around 100 ml or 200 ml vial will be there, which will be appearing as white milk color. Okay, that fat emulsion should be infused, should not be infused more than 0.15 gram per kg per hour. So it should not be given so fast. The drip should be less than 0.15 gram per kg per hour. Okay, that you should remember. Next, protein requirement. Okay, I'll discuss only. I'll complete this by protein requirement. I will with this slide I will end it. Okay, next time I'll discuss about the enteral and parenteral nutrition. So protein requirement, so basic requirement of protein. So protein usually will measure in the terms of nitrogen, because nitrogen is a part of the amino acid. Protein is nothing but the building blocks of all amino acids. Within the amino acid, there will be a nitrogen will be there. So basic requirement of nitrogen. There is an equation also, actually, nitrogen balance. Nitrogen balance, there is an equation. So how much nitrogen the patient, how much nitrogen, total nitrogen balance, how much you have to calculate the total nitrogen balance, nitrogen loss, and the difference between the total nitrogen intake and the nitrogen loss will give you the total nitrogen. Okay, that you should measure. There is a separate equation that is again, that is beyond this topic. Okay, that is also beyond this topic. So you just remember the basic requirement of nitrogen per day is 0.10 to 0.15 gram per kg per day. 0.1 to 0.15 gram per kg per day. In hypermetabolic state, that is sepsis, septic shock, trauma, acute trauma, in such cases the requirement of the protein will be increased to 0.2 to 0.25 gram per day. Okay, protein in the market you will be getting as amino well, that is amino acids infusion. Yes, we are using this. We are using these amino acid infusions in the post-operative surgical patient, and the post in the acute trauma patient, in the acute sepsis patient. These are available. We are using it. Proteins, we are using fat emulsions, we are using carbohydrate, protein, fat mixed emulsions, we are using glucose plus fat emulsions, we are using. These are available in our market, and we are using in our hospital also. Okay, so in hypermed, so you need to remember. So what, so number one is energy requirement is 20 to 25 kilocalories per kg per day, sorry, 20 to 30 kilocalories per kg per day. Glucose requirement is 100 to 200 grams per day. Fat requirement is 100 to 200 grams per week. Protein requirement is 0.10 to 0.15 gram per kg per day. These should be remembered. Okay, so that is the macronutrients. So micronutrients, which include vitamin B, vitamin C, vitamin B12, fat soluble vitamins, that is vitamin A, D, E, K. Okay, so these also, if the patient is having deficiency, definitely patient, a surgical patient or a septic shock patient or an acute trauma patient or a post surgical patient, definitely patient will be having a loss of these nutrients. So vitamin B and vitamin C, see in every post surgical patients we put as multivitamin Ginkgo tablet and vitamin C Lim-C tablet we'll put as a daily orders. Okay, why is the vitamin B and vitamin C, whenever they ask why there is a requirement for a B complex and vitamin C, is they will improve the wound healing. They will improve the wound healing, and they will improve, they will increase in the collagen synthesis. Increase in the collagen synthesis. Okay, collagen synthesis and wound healing. Next is the vitamin B12. Yes, vitamin B12 is important in specific cases where the patient has undergone a intestinal resection. For example, some gangrene of the small bowel, or some gangrene of the ileocecal mass, which has been a right hemicolectomy was performed. In such cases, vitamin B12 is given as an infusion form. Okay. Next, vitamin A, D, E, K are lost in bile and steatorrhea. So in cases of pancreatitis, severe pancreatitis, there will be steatorrhea will be there. Okay, steatorrhea will be there. That is passing out of foamy stools, which cannot be flushed. Foamy, foul-smelling stools. It's called as steatorrhea. Okay. Next, sodium, potassium, and phosphate are also lost in diarrhea or vomiting, which you should be replacing with IV fluids, with crystalloids, that is ringer lactate or a dextrose normal saline. And other trace elements, that is magnesium, zinc, iron, are decreased during an inflammatory state. So these all should be monitored. And these should be replaced appropriately. Okay. So this is the basic nutrition. First half of the only I have completed half of the nutrition topic, but rest of half of the nutrition topic is very important. That is the enteral nutrition. Now what you have learned is the first you have to assess the nutritional status of the patient, that is must stool. Okay, then requirements, once you have assessed how to monitor, that is daily feeding, fortnightly and weekly monitoring should be done. And next is nutritional requirement, how much carb, how much fat, how much protein, and how much micronutrients, what all should be given, should be assessed. Next, the route of nutritional support, how you are going to give, either you are giving through orally, or you are giving through enterally, or you are given through parenterally. Okay, that you should be knowing. Okay, so that one I will discuss you in the later class. Okay, time is not permitting. So this figure you can see, the spoon is there. Okay, spoon, whole food by mouth, you can give it through mouth. Okay, enteral feeding means whatever nutrition is giving, you are giving through mouth, or water for nutritional requirements you are giving into the intestine. Nutritional requirements will go into the intestine, that is you can give by food through the mouth. The patient will take through the mouth, it will come esophagus, stomach, duodenum, jejunum, and absorption. Okay, you can give the nutrition through the tubes, you can give through nasogastric, nasal, gastric, or nasoduodenal into the duodenum, or nasojejunum into the jejunum. Okay, and another thing is gastrostomy tube and jejunostomy tube. This gastrostomy from outside to inside of the stomach, jejunostomy from outside to inside of the jejunum. Okay, these are the enteral feeding: food by mouth, nasogastric, nasoduodenal, nasojejunal, gastrostomy, jejunostomy. This will come all under the enteral nutrition. So enteral nutrition means nutrition given into the gastrointestinal tract. Okay, TPN, that is total parenteral nutrition. PPN, peripheral parenteral nutrition. Parenteral, usually we will spell it as parenteral nutrition. It is parenteral, that is parenteral, par from the enteral, that is not enteral. Par, that is into the circulation, into the IV, through the into the circulation you are giving the nutrients. Parenteral, that is you are not using the enteric system, that is the enteral gastrointestinal tract you are not using, you are using the circulation, you are giving through the IV, central IV line and peripheral IV line. Okay, this way I will discuss. This is actually a huge topic and a very important topic and a very important question in the exam. You will be given as enteral nutrition or parenteral nutrition, TPN they will give, and you have to write for everything. There are indication, contraindication, complication, and the type of that is how much you are giving for both TPN, PPN. Indications, contraindications, and complications. These three are common. Okay, so this I will be discussing. I don't know when my class will come next time. When my class comes, I will discuss this topic, and fluid therapy also I will discuss. Okay, so thanks for your patient hearing. Thank you.